In the late 1980s, Charles Maponga, who was originally from Zimbabwe, traveled to the United States to study for his Doctor of Pharmacy at the University of Buffalo. It was there that he met Professor Gene Morse, a young scholar who shared his interest in stopping the HIV epidemic. Following his studies, Charles returned home and took up a position at the University of Zimbabwe, but he remained in contact with Gene. It was through Gene that Charles and his new colleagues at the University of Zimbabwe became involved in the AIDS Clinical Trials Group. And it was together with this global network of HIV researchers that the scientists at the University of Zimbabwe became involved in some of the highest impact HIV clinical trials around the world, including a series of trials that provided the evidence for treatment as prevention, which was instrumental in slowing the spread of AIDS. So while this case suggests that the researchers at the University of Zimbabwe leveraged the return home of Charles and his relationship with Gene to develop their scientific capacity and participate in high impact research, whether this is a causal relationship is an empirical question. And so in this study, I asked, can scientists returning home to Africa following training in the United States build bridges between non-migrants in the institutions they return to and American-based scientists? And what are the impact of these bridges, if any, on innovative performance? I also explore under which conditions non-migrants are most likely to benefit and how they might benefit. So why am I asking this question? Well, scientific activity around the world is highly skewed, even after adjusting for relative differences in economic activity. And in an attempt to explain this relative skew in activity, I consider science as a global system with, for the most part, pooled inputs and a shared audience around the world. And this is particularly true for scientists based in Africa, with little to no resources of their own or outlets for science. They're really reliant on the rest of the world. One pooled input worth mentioning is knowledge. So if we think of scientists as standing on the shoulders of other scientists, the global production of knowledge is a crucial input into subsequent knowledge generation and others' ideas production functions. And we have a good understanding that knowledge doesn't travel very well over geographic distance, and particularly over national borders. And so for those scientists located in places that are far away from these dominant knowledge producers elsewhere in the world, it can be a challenge to access the latest knowledge, which is a crucial input into subsequent knowledge generation. So compounding these difficulties associated with geographic distance from dominant producers and users of knowledge, I also argue that there's a global status ordering of scientists. Why does this matter? Well, take as an example these early academies of science, which depicted in this picture, which reserved just 40 chairs for an elite group of scientists. And the members of this exclusive invisible college also benefited from superior access to knowledge, resources, and recognition as a consequence of their status. And for those outside these exclusive circles, it was a huge challenge to access these necessary inputs into their own production function. And Merton accurately described this phenomenon in the 60s when he was talking about the Republic of Science. He said, "Rich get rich, poor get poorer." So location determines in part one's relative position in this global status ordering of scientists, and thus drives access to resources, recognition, and knowledge. This could account for that observed skew in global scientific production. And for African scientists who are by many measures less elite than their global peers, this could present additional challenges to developing their scientific capacity. But one way that social or physical outsiders can develop their scientific capacity and access crucial inputs into their production function is to develop ties with insiders or scientists from high-income countries who in theory can share their knowledge, resources, and even their status with their affiliates. And an increasingly popular strategy to develop these ties is to study abroad. So governments and donors are increasingly encouraging low-income country nationals to study in a high-income country with the hope that they return home following their studies and bring their knowledge and their connections with them. But unfortunately, recent evidence actually finds disappointing results of the return home of scientists, finding these scientists experience decline in productivity on return to low-income countries. Also, recent evidence suggests that the development of these international ties can actually increase inequality amongst low-income country scientists. So this provides a motivation to look beyond the individual trained abroad or developing these ties. And in this study, I look at whether there are any spillover impacts of the return home of these foreign trained individuals. And specifically, I look at the impact of the return home of these foreign trained individuals on non-migrants in the institutions that they return to. So in thinking about how returning scientists can impact non-migrant innovation outcomes, I'm considering the role of the broader institutional environment and the network that these scientists are embedded in. And specifically, global science exhibits a core periphery network structure. And by that we mean, and this figure illustrates central actors, in this case the US institutions, are more densely connected and they benefit from superior access to knowledge, resources, and recognition. Whilst in the same network, peripheral actors, in this case African institutions, are more loosely connected and they suffer from issues of legitimacy. So returning scientists moving from core to periphery and taking their central connections with them can act as a broker between these two environments. And in reconciling the mixed evidence we have on the impact of associating with a broker or secondhand brokerage, I provide some theoretical conditions under which we would expect a benefit to exist. Namely, for outsiders who cannot leverage their own network position, in settings where a broker has an incentive to share with their affiliates, and in settings where knowledge isn't so sticky that the broker can share. And I argue that returning scientists to African institutions provide the ideal theoretical conditions under which we'd expect non-migrants in the institutions they return to benefit. And specifically that these returnees can sponsor peripheral scientists and provide what I call a core periphery bridge to central resources and knowledge. I further argue that non-migrants can access both the knowledge and the network position of these returning scientists, and that this is likely to be most useful for non-migrant scientists who are more isolated or more peripheral. So I test these propositions through evaluating the impact of the return home of African scientists who trained in the United States as part of the NIH Fogarty AIDS International Research Training Program. This program provides US principal investigators in the most elite US institutions to host low-income country scientists in master's, PhD, and postdoc programs, and then incentivizes them to return home following their studies. So I evaluate the impact of the return home of these trainees on non-migrant innovation outcomes through examining the change in publication outcomes for non-migrants who receive a returning scientist in their institution before and after that return event, as compared to matched control scientists who are affiliated with a similar institution in Africa but don't receive a returning scientist in that time period. And I exploit the graduation date of this returning scientist to ascertain a causal impact of this return home on non-migrant innovation outcomes. And in order to account for individual scientist heterogeneity, I also include individual level fixed effects in a difference in differences empirical model. So what do I find? Well, I find that following the return home of these American trained scientists, non-migrants affiliated with institutions that they return to in Africa experience a 6% annual increase in publication output as compared to matched control scientists affiliated with institutions not receiving a returning scientist, but are otherwise similar prior to the return event. And I find that this effect is nearly predominantly driven by publications without the returning scientists. So I can't say that it's just the returning scientists co-authoring with these scientists once they get back. So I explore how the non-migrants benefit from association with what I call the core periphery bridge a little bit by using some other outcome measures. And specifically, I find that these non-migrants are able to share the knowledge that the returnee has access to. And I look at this through measuring citation rates to the US training institution of that returning scientist. And I find that non-migrants are more likely, in fact, 33% more likely to cite the US training institution of the returning scientist after the return event as compared to matched control scientists. I also find that these non-migrants are able to share the connections that the returning scientist has access to. I look at collaboration rates with scientists based in that US training institution following the return event. And I find that non-migrants are, again, 33% more likely to collaborate with scientists from that US training institution following the return event as compared to matched control scientists. I look at which kinds of non-migrants are most affected by these return events by splitting my sample of non-migrants, both treated and control, into 3 different groups. So the first group is those who are already well connected to these training institutions. So they're sort of an in-group in columns 1 and 4. The second group are those who are connected to some other OECD scientists, so perhaps the French or British, And the third group in columns 3 and 6 here are those who are not well connected to OECD scientists at all. So they're mostly doing within region collaborations, and they don't have this central or core connection. And I find that the effect, consistent with my theoretical predictions, is predominantly driven by this third group of those scientists who are more peripheral and cannot leverage their own network position and don't already have a central connection. So we explore how these non-migrants are benefiting through using some qualitative data that I gathered through my fieldwork and numerous interviews with returning scientists and non-migrants. And I find evidence that these non-migrants are benefiting from sponsorship from the returning scientist who's making introductions for them. And one returning trainee said to me, I was a big go-between. If people at my institution are specialized in different ways from me and people in the United States reach out to me, I introduce them. So this sponsorship idea that the returning scientist is able to validate and provide these introductions for these non-migrants who wouldn't usually have that kind of opportunity. So to conclude, I find large spillovers from the return migration of scientists. And in fact, I do a quick ROI calculation and I find that these spillovers within my sample, which we can consider an underestimate of the total spillovers because I don't account for outside institution spillovers, I find that these account for around 80% of the direct innovation output from the returning scientists. So program evaluations of programs of this kind typically hunt for the impact of the program on the trained or the treated individual, with really disappointing results sometimes. And I think these results suggest that perhaps we've been asking slightly the wrong question and looking in the wrong place for the full impact of these programs to estimate the full ROI. So on the theoretical side, I find that contextual factors really shape the impact of this bridging. Particularly, I find that those scientists in these African institutions who were already connected to OECD institutions didn't benefit at all from this return event. So this tells us something about the design of the programs and how to think about secondhand brokerage more generally. I also find more broadly that innovative performance depends on both institutional environment and networks. And this is really the central idea of most of my research agenda. And so typically research has focused on one or the other of these features of the innovation environment and innovation performance. And I try to think of them both, particularly in the context of African science. So, thank you very much.